Thank you. That was too kind of an introduction. Indeed, I do study grit. When Nancy gave me just 1 degree of freedom and said I could talk about what I wanted to, I decided not to talk about grit because nobody ever asked me to come talk about self-control. But indeed, by the grant numbers and by the number of people, our lab works more on self-control than it does on grit. So the slides are, yes, the slides are there. Okay, great. So I want to say that I made this quote up in deference to former APS President Walter Mischel. I believe I emailed him one day and I said, Walter, can I say that you said that the most important scientific discovery about self-control is that it can be taught? And he wrote back, sure. I think this is a relatively accurate statement of Walter does believe. Of course, the popular public knows now his marshmallow test, which has been on the Colbert Report no fewer than 3 times, if you add it all up. And I think that in some ways, the predictive power of the marshmallow test belies, in a sense, the most important insight from Walter's decades of research, which is that in observing these young children wait for 2 marshmallows instead of 1, they employed an array of ingenious strategies in order to delay longer. And Walter's strong belief was that those strategies could be directly taught and practiced. In my own work on self-control, I beg, borrow, steal, I collaborate with whomever I can, and about 4 years ago, I met the incomparable James Gross. And I'm guessing that about half of you are currently writing a paper with him, even at this moment, because eventually everybody works with James Gross. But what really struck me about him was that he was able to bring together so many disparate findings in self-regulation. Now, many of you know that James primarily works on grown-ups, and he primarily works on emotion regulation. But the model that he's developed in that realm, I think, has implications for unifying more broadly what we would consider self-regulation or self-control. The process model says that impulses develop. So they begin perhaps quite weak and then gather strength. And it is by intervening in the process of impulse generation earlier rather than later, then we can be really smart about how to exercise self-control in our lives. And so I'll just take you through from situation selection, which is the earliest stage at which you can intervene, all the way through to response modulation, what I mean. And let me illustrate with some data that James and our lab collected recently from a local high school where we presented to students from 9th through 12th grade a variety of examples of each of the 5 stages in the process model, which I'll describe to you one by one. But I'll just say that when high school students read examples of modifying their situation versus using attention in a strategic way versus cognitively changing the way they think about things, the striking finding is that students tell us that to choose your situation or change your situation in ways that are very intentional, that's actually probably going to be much more effective than any of the later cognitive strategies. So this indeed is the prediction of the process model, that intervening earlier should be better than intervening later. I will say that we would have loved for the same students to tell us that each of the subsequent cognitive strategies would just be a little bit less effective, but data never cooperate exactly. So I think the gist of it is that the students have an intuition that intervening early is better than intervening later. Now, the first thing that one can do, according to James and the process model, is to choose your situation, to choose where to be. Well, what do I mean by that? For example, all of the undergraduates who work in my lab take an oath that says that they will sit at the front of the classroom, the first 3 rows specifically. And I always get the same question, oh, do you mean in your class? Nope, I don't mean in my class, I mean in all of your classes. Do you mean in the psychology classes? Nope, I mean in every single lecture that you attend. Of course, they want an explanation for this, and the explanation is that when I was in college, taking a class on ancient Chinese bronzes, I could do nothing more than just to sit in the front of the class to prevent myself from falling asleep for the entire lecture. Sitting in the front of the class is putting myself in a situation where social norms and pure shame would be working to my advantage to keep my attention on what I needed to do as opposed to something I'd rather be doing, napping, reading, anything else, versus the sort of the nosebleed section. So you can do things like choose your physical situation. You can also choose, to some extent, your social situation. Recently, we did a focus group of 10th and 5th graders at a school in New York City. Tough neighborhood, schools were 100% free and reduced price lunch. And I listened to a 10th grader sagely advise the 5th grader, if I only knew when I was your age what I know now, I would have picked my friends differently, because I got into the wrong crowd, and you never can tell yourself how much your friends are really going to influence you. So there's selecting your physical situation to advantage, going to the library instead of studying in a noisy house, choosing to sit at the front of the class versus the back of the class, and you can choose your social situation to some extent. We think that these are intuitive to students who, for example, in the same data set that I mentioned to you before, would, when asked about, tell us about self-control in your own life, and tell us a story about you had something that you had to resist as a temptation and what you did. I'll just read 2 verbatim suggestions of students who, in this open-ended prompt, gave us things that we classified as being situation selection. So I would go to the library, as being in a quiet and controlled environment would make me focus. I would lock myself in a room without my phone so that it does not become a distraction. Now, many students do not have the liberty or the logistical possibility of changing where they are. And so we think that it's also important that they learn to modify their situation. And that is to say, once choosing where you are or having it foisted upon you, you can certainly change physical aspects of the situation. Now, Brian Wansink at Cornell University has a large number of studies that have shown that physical cues, like is the glass a tall glass or a short glass, is the soup bowl a big bowl or a small bowl, can dramatically influence eating behavior. And this is an example, we think, of situation modification if it's not Brian Wansink determining the size of your soup bowl, but you determining the size of your soup bowl. So we feel like this insight that physical cues matter can be harnessed by the individual to say, I'm going to keep the cookies in my house in a cookie jar I can't see through. Unlike the cookie jar in my house, which, like most cookie jars, is clear and tempts me every time I walk by. In terms of students and academic success, which is really where my heart is, there's the simple modification of closing the laptop while you're sitting in lecture. On the left, you have the typical scene of students with their laptops open, on eBay, checking their email accounts. I told my husband that this was generally true of professors who were lecturing in large classes, but not in my class, where everybody was really just taking notes and paying rapt attention to me. So he went to my class and sat in the back row and took a picture of my class, and then pointed out to me that one intrepid student was actually watching a full-length feature film during the hour and 20-minute lecture, which I thought was particularly humiliating. I don't know for the student or for me, but anyway, it wasn't good. So, minor techniques. This is, of course, only if you as a student have a conflict, you both want to go onto Instagram and listen to Dr. Duckworth tell you what's on the final exam. And if you feel that listening to what's going to be on the final exam is, in the long run, probably a better use of your time, and yet you're pulled by Instagram, that's classic self-control conflict, and this minor situational adjustment can actually just make it that much easier. Here are some verbatim suggestions of high school students. Quote, I would shut off my phone and put it under my pillow so I wouldn't be tempted to touch it. Quote, I would ask my mom to take away my phone and other distractions to make sure I can get it done on time. Now, I won't play this clip, I'll just fast forward, but I'll just say that we've been very inspired by the behavior change work of folks like Carol Dweck and her kind of extended family, her progeny, folks like Greg Walton and David Yeager, who have shown that in very carefully crafted, brief online interventions, you can have reasonably large effects on behavior change. So we picked up a bunch of tips from them, and we took the Brian Wansink research and we created an intervention. We taught kids how to modify their situations. And I'll try to skip through the actual video. We tried to make it cool and fun. And in a 1-week longitudinal field study with high school students, at baseline, students were randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions. They learned about situation modification. They learned about a later strategy, response modulation, just kind of good old-fashioned willpower, don't do it. And then finally, a no treatment control condition. Now, at baseline, in addition to getting these treatment assignments, students set an academic goal, which they then 1 week later were asked to report on. And in this data, you can see that self-reported goal accomplishment was higher in the situation modification group than either of the 2 comparison groups. We replicated this with a large sample of college students. Again, those who were given information about how they could use situation modification to meet their academic goals did better in doing so than 2 comparisons. And importantly, we found what we hypothesized, which is partial mediation. Well, we would have loved full mediation, but mediation to some extent by self-reported temptation during that week. In other words, students who learned to turn off their cell phones, put away their laptops when they were trying to read a book, et cetera, felt fewer feelings of temptation towards those other objects, and that at least partially explained the effect of the intervention on goal accomplishment. Now, I should say a word about these latter 3 strategies, but I'll be more brief because James and I don't believe that they're as effective as these earlier upstream situational strategies. So first, there is selectively attending, looking at things in ways that you think will make it easier to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong one. So for example, at the KIPP charter schools, and there are many of them in New York, but they're now all over the country, they have recognized from fairly early in their establishment, these schools, but probably 10 or 15 years ago, they recognized that, for sure it's hard to pay attention to your teacher. It's hard to just look at your teacher when you'd rather look elsewhere. But they also recognize that by looking at your teacher, and I'll give you an example. This is a KIPP classroom. They're all looking at the teacher. At KIPP, they call it tracking. It's tracking the teacher. That by accomplishing that, you then make it easier to do what's even harder, which is to truly listen and encode and engage with the academic material. In other words, you can look out the window if you want to, and then it's going to be darn near impossible to pay attention at all or to process the history lesson. Or you can track the speaker, which they do at KIPP schools, and that facilitates downstream regulation of the things that you need to do. So selectively attending, what does it look like when high school students explain they can not look at their phone, ignore my phone, or they can direct their internal attention to things that are more useful in terms of regulation. Remind myself that even the most boring classes count towards my GPA. I will note that even though in Walter Mischel's early studies of the marshmallow, students, I guess I should say 4-year-olds, they're not students yet, children who selectively look at objects that are not the marshmallow are able to wait longer. So selective attention, strategic attention emerges as one of the most important strategies in those early preschool studies. Notably, this was the least commonly nominated strategy among high school students that we surveyed, which we haven't quite figured out why, but we note the disparity. Now, what do you do once you've chosen where you're going to be, modified the situation or not, attended to what you've decided to attend to? You can, of course, change your mind. You can reframe or change the cognitive representation of the situation. There are many ways to do this, but one very important way relevant to self-control, self-regulation is reconstruing the distance of the situation, psychological distancing. So in one random assignment study in collaboration with Ethan Cross, kids at 5th grade were either chosen to replay an event of an angry memory as it unfolds in their own eyes, that's the first person immersed egocentric control condition, or alternatively in the intervention, to replay the event as it unfolds as they observed their distant self, the third person. Or most effectively, it's like you're in a YouTube video. Oh, okay, now I know what you mean. Okay, so this is very facilitative of emotion regulation, in particular regulating the lingering negative emotions of that angry memory easier when you're seeing yourself in the third person, like you are a fly in the wall in the situation versus from the first person egocentric perspective. I recently had an argument with my spouse and tried to do this. I was like, oh, okay, I'll do. Angela Duckworth had an argument with her spouse. It didn't really work, actually. I was, flooded with emotion. But I will say this. I think that in general, the very exciting work on psychological distancing and reconstrual, it opens up a whole doorway of things like just the very idea that the mental representation, that there's still some agency there, that there's still an opportunity there for us to regulate. I think is very important. Here are some verbatim suggestions of high school students. Quote, I would plan something for myself that I would only do if I got straight A's. So I would sort of, think about pairing the homework with, later reward. I would set goals, break the project up into pieces. I will say this, and I know there's not opportunity for questions and discussion, categorizing what students, in this open-ended way would just tell us that they would do was very difficult, and also made me realize some of the limitations of the process model, which have these 5 neat, distinctions, but actually in reality end up being, not distinctions that are very well respected by high school students who tell us that they do, more than one strategy at once, or things that are hard to categorize, things that are kind of on the border. So let me just tell you about the last stage, which doesn't need much telling at all, because this is really just good old-fashioned don't do it, or do it, depending on what you're trying to. As the Buddhists would say, and as the Buddhists would disrecommend, this is simply crushing mind with mind, right? And I think, just in thinking about the work that was presented earlier, in some ways, this discussion of, early self-regulation leading to sort of higher order, more sophisticated ways of regulation, I think of this as kind of, executive function in its rawest form. There's almost no art or strategy to it at all. What does that look like if you're talking about high school students? Don't be a baby and just study. Just deal with it and study. Just do it. Just focus and get my work done. And we actually use the word just in our coding manual as a sign that really kids were, talking about this last stage. I want to end by saying that, whatever strategy it is that you use to sit in the front of the lecture hall, to, turn your phone off, to look at the teacher, not look out the window, to frame a situation in a particular way, it of course helps to do some advanced planning. And I think that the work of Gabrielle Ettingen and Peter Gollwitzer could not be more influential for myself as a scientist, as well as almost everybody that I know who works on behavior change. So I will just quickly say that their work where students are encouraged in a very systematic way to set goals and to, in advance, plan how they hope to act in a certain situation. So goal setting and goal planning seems to, for example, in our joint work, in a random assignment, placebo-controlled, longitudinal field study over the course of half of an academic year, this brief intervention is able to improve GPA from school records, as well from school records, school attendance, being on time, and teachers who are blind to condition, their ratings of classroom conduct during that semester. It is not a miracle. So, for, subsequently, behavior returns, and there's, the difference between the control group and the intervention group erode to non-significance. But I do think it's really a promising direction in order for us to put everything together that's known about these higher level metacognitive strategies. So all of the things that I talked about in the process model, can they get wrapped in a way in the kind of mental contrasting and implementation intention work that Gabrielle and Peter are doing. And then finally, I will just say, to expand the scope even broader than what I've tried to do already, I believe that there's a role for habit formation that has just begun to get some traction on. In our work, we find that more self-controlled individuals, more self-controlled students in particular, have stronger study habits. They study at the same time every day. They study in the same place every day. My daughter is an exception to this. She feels like it's much better to wake up every day and decide on the spot what you're gonna do and how you're gonna do it in a more reactive way. And I'll show her this figure when I get home, which is that more self-controlled kids tend to have these habits, and those habits mediate to a large extent the positive effects on self-control on things like studying when things are difficult, and also grades. And so let me end with this slide from William James, and in his classic work in 1899 said, virtues are habits as much as vices. Our nervous systems grow to the way in which they have been exercised, just as a sheet of paper, once creased or folded, tends to fall forever afterward into the same identical folds. So let the children learn the process model strategies and let them learn mental contrasting and implementation intentions. Let them learn the folds that we think will set them up for success later in life. And thank you for your attention. Thank you, Nancy, for having me. I've really appreciated the opportunity. Thanks.